What's up, guys? I wanted to give you guys an update. This is going to be on my YouTube channel. Sorry for the road noise. I'm a big pickup truck on the highway, so it's not going to be that quiet. I had the opportunity to come up here with Andy Stumpf and do a podcast on the Cleared Hot podcast, which is his podcast. Andy's a former Navy SEAL, enlisted officer, done a whole bunch of things in his career, and medically retired, base jumper, wingsuit flyer, pilot, the list goes on. A lot of cool stuff. His podcast is a great podcast. I recommend you guys subscribing to it and give it a listen. About a 3-hour podcast with Andy. Long podcast, great conversation, talking about some things that I don't think either of us had talked about in depth. Really cool opportunity, so big shout out to Andy. I'm leaving Montana now and thinking about everything that's going on in the world. This place isn't as infected as most places in the populated United States. New York's over 10,000 deaths. The U.S. I think is over 22,000. This is a different world we live in, economically, socially. Definitely a new circumstance and a new world. I kind of wanted to talk to you guys about that because, you know, there's a whole bunch of ideas about where this is going, and taking that information and maybe articulating to you guys what I think is going to potentially happen might set you up for success in how you prepare. I talk about preparedness as an equal opportunist, right? Disasters don't care who you are. Catastrophes, man-made or natural, don't care who you are as a person. And so they'll affect you if you're rich, if you're poor, it doesn't matter. So when we think about preparedness, Glover Road, I just passed Glover Road in Montana, that's right. So what I mean by that is survival or getting through a difficult circumstance happens to us all. So when we look at forecasting the potential disasters in our lives, we should prepare for that worst case scenario. Pandemics are along the lines of the worst case scenario. I mean, who would have thought when I did this first video a month ago, or maybe even more than a month ago, talking about the coronavirus in its early stages, that we would be where we're at right now. We would be quarantined, self-quarantined and contained. We'd have shelter-in-place orders. People would be getting arrested for opening their businesses because they're not essential. People would be getting arrested for paddle boarding in the ocean, the Pacific Ocean specifically, because there's a shelter-in-place order. That people would be locking down public transportation, mass transit. All the things that we thought we understood about the potential of things happening are now happening. I still hear people talk about how this is just like the fucking flu. And it drives me insane because I feel sorry for those people who are so miseducated that think this is the flu. It's, number one, outside of your own understanding of the science behind what's going on, does it look like the flu? Because the flu doesn't lock down anybody, doesn't self-quarantine in place, doesn't have task force, doesn't have PPE shortages. So outside of your own beliefs and understanding of what you think this is, you are in a different reality. So every time people say this and they perpetuate the same messaging, oh, this is just like the flu, get a grasp on fucking reality. This is not. Because even if you think it is, look at the world in which you live. Because you probably are unemployed. If you're lucky, you're working from home, but your kids aren't going to school. And the future for you and your family is uncertain. Just that alone should be enough for you to tone down your rhetoric just a little to understand that this isn't. New York City's already reported that in 3 days, they've had as many deaths as they have in 1 year from the common flu. So this is definitively not that. So let's talk about some of the updates that the CDC, the scientists, Fauci, and the task force is talking. New York City is the epicenter of this because of the densely populated area that is New York City, with people stacked on top of each other, and the way that infrastructure is composed. You're seeing the highest rates of transmission, of deaths, and the list goes on. If you are obese, you are one of the highest risk factors out of all the populations in the coronavirus epicenter. So if you are unhealthy, obese, have compromised immunity, have underlying health issues, you don't need to be going anywhere near people because you're high risk. If you're not, because you're healthy, etc., you need to be thinking about those people in our nation that are obese. Remember, we're the United States of America. We're broken down into specific little mini countries and mini ecosystems that should run independent of the federal government. Because the circumstances like here in beautiful Montana aren't the same in the epicenters of New York, Los Angeles, Washington, the list goes on. So what does that mean? Well, that means people in specific areas that are more rural, that are less likely to have community spread, right? Community spread is one of the check the blocks and prerequisites for a pandemic, which means there's a widespread of the virus or infectious disease within the community without the ability to trace the origin or source. So when you're in a place like rural Montana, it's easy for you to understand that you could identify who spread the virus, where it came from, and how it got into the population, because it's not densely populated or oversaturated with people where you can't figure out what the hell is going on. The community widespread virus, this prerequisite for pandemics, started in Washington State, and it spread throughout the United States. I personally think, because me and everybody in my family, my friends, were sick in January, that the reason, one of the reasons California, for example, isn't showing this widespread model like epicenters all over the United States is because I think it was there before February and March. I personally think I might even have had it. People around me might have had it because we were at SHOT Show, where Chinese people were at SHOT Show. I mean, historically, the SHOT Show is a ground for the Chinese coming over and ripping off designs to take back to China. I mean, everybody you talk to who has booths, and I've known this for over a decade, going to SHOT Show, that they go into the SHOT Show, take pictures, take measurements, and steal what is the United States companies and reproduce it overseas. That's known, and in their culture, it's not a big deal. But I know personally companies that have shooed them away. I've seen them on the floor. Not saying that everybody from China is stealing intellectual property, but that's how it usually works. So the thinking that potentially it's already rampant in the country beforehand is not outside of the question, not outside of reality. Now, here's a couple debates. One of the debates is the information that's being accumulated isn't accurate. I would say that's true. I mean, look, human beings are routinely flawed. So let's not pretend that any model or any data points are holistically going to be accurate and precise. When you have human beings doing models, the likelihood of there being corruption, of there being misrepresentation, of there being flawed data is always likely. I mean, that's just human nature. So is the death rate or mortality rate the actual rate? Is the actual numbers of 22,500 people the actual numbers? Who the fuck knows? But partially, does it fucking matter? Because the data that we have coming in is a lot of people were infected and a lot of fucking people are dying. So when you just look at those parameters, like, yeah, there's skewed data. People are reporting that hospitals, some hospitals, because they want the PPE, they want the funding, they want the support, are reporting that any maligned infections that are tied to corona, like a person gets bacterial pneumonia and they die. Well, some hospitals are being reported as reporting that as COVID-19. So yeah, the data is flawed. But the rate in which people are dying, where 700 to 800 people a day are dying in New York City alone, is not within the realms of that being flawed. I mean, that they are going through a tragic and volatile circumstance. I reported on it, or I put a post up on it in New York City, where they're burying in mass graves all the people who are unidentified who don't have next of kin. Ultimately, we should understand that that's fucking tragic. That's horrible. So the bottom line is, there's shit going on that's not grossly affecting us. It's not affecting me. But does that mean that we underplay it or we undermine it? I've seen people in my own network talking about how it's so fucked up that we're doing what we're doing. Well, not really. I mean, look, we're not at the tipping point. We haven't broke our backs. Look, we've been asked to stay at home, to self-quarantine. For most places in the United States, is that going to help? Maybe not. But if we're doing so for the overall good of helping people or helping cities like New York City not fucking destroy those places. Now, there is a tipping point. The tipping point in which we break our economy and it fucks us up. Psychologically, our nation will never be the same. Imagine what we're going through now is an experience that one soldier experiences in war. And that takes place over time. You go to war, you're in combat, you're under high levels of stress and anxiety. That's what we're living right now. So after it's all said and done, our psychology isn't going to be the same for decades, because it's going to take us to cycle through this pandemic, get to a point to where we're returned to normal, and even then, we're still going to be fucked up. I mean, I look at people, even my own friends, as carriers for COVID. I'm not even looking at them as human beings. I'm like, this motherfucker is like my buddy, but he's a carrier, and I don't want him to affect me. So even in our own internal networks, we're developing this behavior to look at things that way. And we don't want to touch people. We don't want to be around people. Well, that ultimately is going to create psychological issues that are going to transcend second and third order effects through our economy, through our schools, through our education systems, through our institutions. The list goes on. I mean, imagine if you're a healthcare worker and you're in New York City in the Bronx, and you're seeing dozens of people die every single day, and then one day you're trying to get back to normal. That will never be the same. I was watching a news report where you could hear the sound of oxygen tanks everywhere because everybody was on a respirator or some kind of oxygen. And so that in itself, that noise, that's going to cause post-traumatic stress with the association of people dying, and that's just not normal. So what do I think the prediction is? Well, here's a couple routes. One, the federal government, specifically under Trump, is not going to allow our economy to be destroyed, because I'm assuming, from what I've heard in snippets of information, that his advisors, his economic advisors, outside of the science that's taking place in advising with the coronavirus specifically, is telling the president that if we continue on this road to unemployment to breaking small business, destroying our economy, is going to cause second and third order effects that are more profound than the COVID would ever be. Right? The estimates, if we have no mitigation, is anywhere from 1 million to 2.2 million people will die if we just allow ourselves to go back to normal. So what you already see is states in the Northeast and the Pacific Northwest aligning themselves to say, it doesn't matter what the federal government says, we're going to do our own thing. And herein lies the problems that we're going to see in the near future. States saying, go fuck yourself, federal government, and the federal government saying, you can't do that. The President of the United States came out yesterday, Trump came out yesterday and said, these governors are not the president. They don't take orders. The people don't take orders from the governor in these kind of circumstances. They take orders from the President of the United States. I have a feeling, and these governors have already stated, they're going to do what they do to protect the people of their states. That's going to be problematic because these governors are going to think that they know better for their own states, despite what the government, the federal government, says. So here, let's play scenario of devil's advocate. The federal government says go back to work. Mitigate risk by quarantining the high-risk populations, which I think is a good solution in a deliberate plan. Right? That's just not the one variable. There's multiple variables, but that's a good plan. The governors are going to say we're not going back to work because it's a political play, but it's also what they think is best for their states. For example, Governor Cuomo, he'll say, we're not going back to work. We are going to continue to contain and quarantine ourselves. They are going to potentially economically destroy their own states. And then what's going to happen? Well, you already see what's happening right now. In New York City, you have people who are running out of food. You have people who are running out of money and can't afford to live in that place, so they're displacing, right? And that economy and that substructure can't sustain that level of dysfunction. You have people in California, Arizona, New Jersey that are being arrested, right? I posted a story from Winslow, Arizona in my own backyard where a man who was an elderly man in his 70s, who's been a small business owner for 30 years, who sells Native American artifacts. Not artifacts, but Navajo rugs and jewelry and stuff, not artifacts. He was told via the government, the Winslow mayor, that his business is not essential, so he needs to close down. And so they put a sign on his door. They said, you're not essential, you have to close down. If you don't, we're going to arrest you. So he goes to the Department of Commerce in his local community and he changes his business license to department store because department stores have been labeled essential. So the Walmart down the road is able to be open, but the small business mom and pop shop, no matter what you are, unless you're labeled a department store, can't be open. So he changes his business license to department store. He goes and gets hay wholesale and he starts selling hay, right? He's trying to survive. That's what small business entrepreneurs do. That's what we're doing at Fieldcraft Survival. We're adapting. They come in and they arrest him. The sheriff's department arrests this dude. They arrest this 70-year-old old man for, I think he's a Korean War vet, which I'm only saying that because he's a patriot of this country. They arrest him for being open. And I asked myself, where the fuck is the line? Well, to me, that mayor, that city, that department, that police department, or sheriff's department crossed the line. I mean, we have to apply common sense in this because if we're arresting people, and I think it's a civil liberty violation that we're doing that is a problem. So you're telling me it's okay if you go to Walmart a multi-billion-dollar corporation and you're on top of each other in the produce section, that's okay. But if you're going in onesies and twosies buying hay or even Native American whatever, that's not okay. That's a fucking problem. Would you ever see a sheriff's department going in and arresting the CEO of Walmart? You wouldn't. That's a problem. Another aspect of this is the religious context, where you have congregations of people coming together because they want to worship. Now I'm divided here, right? Because if a pastor says to his parishioners or his worshipers, and he says, "Hey, we are going to congregate," and there's reports of people up to 2,000 people coming together to congregate to worship God. Now that is a constitutional right and one of our civil liberties. But herein lies the problem. I don't have a problem with anybody exercising constitutional rights and individual civil liberties, those things that are protected and inherent to us all. But I do have a problem when you risk the lives of people and then put that burden on other people, like the healthcare professionals who have to now risk their lives because you irresponsibly brought people together, even for something like worshiping God. Because there are other means to do so. It's not like you can't do a virtual webinar, seminar. Hell, you could even have smaller groups and partition them in time and exercise social distancing. But to amass 2,000 people is irresponsible. But again, herein lies some of the issues. These are civil and social issues and potential discourse that's going to cause more problems in the second and potential third order effects of this. And then what happens in the third order of this when people are fighting or people are rebelling or people even start out protesting? So what do I think should happen? Well, one, I think we have to be smart and not treat everybody the same. It's like this idea that if one person is causing trouble or one person is potentially sick, then we punish the rest of America. And I don't think it's a punishment, because I think we have to sacrifice in this together. But I think it's problematic when you take that approach, because rural Montana is not the same as New York City. So when you tell people to stay home in rural Montana, it potentially is an issue. Utah, for example, they have locked down certain parts of their state. If you are a foreigner coming out of, for me, Arizona, camping, for example, in a rural part of Utah at a campsite, I got told I can't camp there. Now, do I think that's silly? Absolutely. Because I can go to a hotel or to a Walmart in Utah for being out of state, which exposes me to more people, but you say I can't go potentially to a campsite where I'm remote and I'm social distanced anyways. I think that's bizarre. But I think maybe that the answer lies in giving guidance to individual states to work out a plan of action for their own individual circumstance. Rural Montanans, they can go back to work right now, and will they be grossly affected? No, not really. Especially if small business owners like myself already do. We know what we're doing with our employees. We know which employees are leaving and going out of town. We might even mandate within our own businesses that, hey, if you're going out of town, you have to self-quarantine yourself for 14 days. Or at a minimum, test yourself for the antibodies or take a COVID-19 test to see if you're infectious. And that's how we protect ourselves. Again, that responsibility for people to handle their own business is what I like in Reliance anyways. I don't want to have to depend on the government to dictate to me what I'm going to specifically do. Now, some places like New York City have to have those protocols in place, right? Like that. Because if they don't, there's so many variables and so many people coming and going that no matter what things they do, and if they say, hey, just handle it on your own, they're not going to be able to, people are not going to be able to manage it on their own. So we need the government to facilitate and to help. So what we need to do as a nation is look at our individual circumstances, and those individual circumstances vary, but there's some foundational things that are common to all. One, we know who high-risk populations are. Those high-risk populations need to be self-quarantined, need to be contained, and need to be managed. If you're in a nursing home, if you're in assisted living, if you're in a hospice, those places need to be over-regulated and determined on how they're going to manage the coming and going of people who potentially can infect that high-risk population. If you're obese or you have compromised immunity, you're in that same category. A lot of young people who are obese, especially in New York City, are dying from this because, unbeknownst to them maybe, they have compromised cardiovascular systems. And this viral pneumonia, this viral respiration, these viral respiration issues are making it so the oxygen can't get into them. They're being put on ventilators, and then they don't survive. So those specific populations need to be partitioned. One thing we need to specifically look at is the frequency of tests in individual states, which are pouring out in masses. But I want to know, like if I'm a business owner and I have 100 employees, well, I want to make sure I get all my employees tested, right? So if we're offering that test, whether it's the antibody test to see who potentially had it and now who has immunity to it versus who might be infectious, is important because you need to triage your own people. And if those tests were offered to entrepreneurs, to institutions, then we would be better off for it. So we need to get mass testing out because we need to come up with solutions in triaging our own people. The preparation comes in preparing for when this doesn't end. People ask me all the time, like, where's the end in sight? There is no end in sight. If anybody says they're end in sight, then it's not tied to science. They're like, oh, I think this is going to end in the summertime. Do you fucking know that? Because there's some scientists who are saying this might not end in the summertime. And even if it does end and it's suppressed, that it potentially, like the influenza Spanish flu, will come back in the fall when the cold weather returns. So what does that mean? So does that mean that when we return to business as normal, that all of a sudden that we're going to have to self-quarantine again? Yes. Will there be a normal? I don't think there will be. There is going to be a new normal and a new way of life in which we're going to have to get used to living in. Or we're going to have to have a herd mentality where we just accept the risk and potentially risk 1 to 2.2 million people's lives. And there's some selfish fucking people in these United States that that are friends of mine that are saying, fuck it, let's just get back to work. Well, that's easy for you to say. But guess what? I have a mom. I have a stepfather. I have a family. I don't want to risk my family getting sick and potentially dying over somebody talking to them who's asymptomatic. So what is the answer? Again, mass testing, isolating the high-risk populations, and being situationally aware of your own circumstance. Am I going to go in mass to a basketball game, to a function, to the club, to the bar, to church? No, I'm not. But some people are willing to take that risk. And you know what? That's up to them. You want to take that risk and risk compromising your life or your family's life? Maybe at some point that is on you. But I know what I want to do. I want to self-select. And I'm willing to sacrifice. Hell, I don't even think it's a sacrifice because I don't like to do it anyway. These buffalo, man, beautiful. I don't want to do it anyway. I'm an introvert. Despite my openness and my ability to communicate, I don't like fucking people. I don't want to be around people anyway. So I'll be taking my own precautions. So at some point, outside the protocols that the government has instituted in our own communities, we have to address and determine our own risk. I'm not going to risk my family. I'm not going to risk my friends. I'm not going to risk my business. So I know the precautions I need to take. That education, which I'm trying to give you now, are some of the things that we should be doing anyway. in preparation for food, water, supplies, and everything else. Look, guys, you should be fucking doing that anyway. If you're not doing that, man, shame on you. Because look, it's about understanding economics and supply chain anyways. Look, it only took the idea prior to this going down that we potentially were going to see some damage. A couple organizations saying this looks like a potential before people went crazy, right? People started losing their shit. That's important to understand as a metric in what you should do anyway in preparedness. You should amass independence and reliance away from infrastructure, government, and fucking people. I shouldn't have to depend on anything. And that's how you should look at preparedness. So I say to myself, hey, what do I depend on the grid? Do I have electricity? Am I tied to city water? Am I tied to a 2 to 3 day supply and then a week's supply of food in my community? Well, maybe I need to start looking at ways to become more self-reliant. That's what preparedness is. It's this idea that you are your own first response, that you are solely responsible for your individual self. That character and that responsibility, that onus in managing your own shit is a means to independence. It's a means to self-reliance. It's a means to preparedness replaced for paranoia. All these people who have anxiety, you know why they have anxiety? It's because they're so dependent emotionally, physically, on infrastructures and institutions and other first responders and everything else in their lives that they can't depend on them, and they know it's going to happen, so then they get anxious. Like, what do I do if this happens? Well, when you're more prepared, you don't have to fucking worry about that. I'm prepared, so I don't worry, oh, what am I going to do? I just go, you know what? I got this. I don't have to depend on fucking anybody. I got the land, I got the security, I got the food, I got the water, I got the hygiene, I got the prescriptions, I got the first aid trauma. I got my family healthy. We're preparing our own immunity. We're working out. We're sleeping right. We're eating right. That's preparedness, guys. That's reliance. I'm gonna enjoy this drive through Montana. I appreciate you guys. I'm gonna be posting the walk around of the rig that I'm in right now because a lot of people have been hitting me up. I tried to do it yesterday, but some dude next door was using his chainsaw cutting logs, which I think is awesome. But I'll get to it. Fieldcraftsurvival.com, all the stuff that we do. My personal podcast, which is called the Mike Force Podcast, might be out sometime soon. Peep that if you're interested. The Fieldcraft Survival Podcast, as always. Yeah, man. Guys, I appreciate you guys. Until next time, peace out.